Alright, welcome back. So in this video, we're now going to talk about the concept and the phenomenon of emotional possession. Right? So we're going to go over what it means to be in that state and what happens when you're there and how you get there. Right? So this is the first of two kinds. The second kind was psychic possession, which we'll talk about later. So to go over this first point, it says continually charging a negative emotion generally leads to sinful thoughts that push spiritual energy away. So this is important to understand. So we talked about the concept of sin, right? So a sin is a thought or behavior that pushes spiritual energy away. So we recognize them generally to be in the form of behaviors, right? Thoughts or intentions that manifest themselves as a behavior. So we think of that as sinful behaviors, like lying or stealing. However, it's important to recognize that a thought can also be sinful, even if it doesn't necessarily manifest itself immediately as a behavior. So that's important to recognize too. Now keep in mind that a thought or an intention that charges your subconscious or causes your subconscious to switch to a negative frequency and charge up at that frequency, that alone is not necessarily sinful, right? So that is my belief, right? So like I said, there have been plenty of times where I've felt upset or maybe even I've gotten a little annoyed or even angry with someone or in a situation, and it didn't necessarily feel sinful. And what I mean by that is I didn't feel like my spiritual energy was being pushed away, right? I could still feel it, right? I didn't, like I said before, when you charge up a lot of spiritual energy and you have a strong relationship with God, you can only really get to the high levels without sinning, right? So when you do have a lot of it, a sin feels very, very shocking, right? It feels like you can feel it so much more powerfully, right? At least you're shocked by it so much more. And but when I charge a negative emotion, I don't feel that, right? So like I said, if you've experienced that now and you charge spiritual energy and you draw nearer to God, based on what we discussed in last chapters, or if you've done it before that, right? Then you should know what I'm talking about, right? Now, negative intentions or intentions that charge your subconscious at a negative frequency, they can dampen positive emotions, right? So they can dampen positive emotions. And basically, when you charge more spiritual energy, you feel all positive emotions more easily and you feel negative emotions less, right? Less intensely, right? But, so negative emotions will dampen, it'll feel like it's dampening the feeling of spiritual energy, because it dampens your ability to feel positive emotions, but it doesn't necessarily feel like it's directly pushing spiritual energy away. So that's important. So I just wanted to get that out the way, which is just basically review at this point, that you can charge a negative emotion without it being sinful. However, right, it is still possible, though, to charge a negative emotion in a way that does lead to sinful thoughts, right? So it may not start in a sinful way, or even if you continually do it, it may not necessarily be sinful. But this is something I've noticed, or something I believe. If you continually produce negative intentions that charge your subconscious at a negative frequency, it will lead to sinful types of thoughts, right? And you may be able to produce a sinful thought without necessarily charging it, right? So it depends. But in my experience, sinful thoughts are generally produced after continually charging at a negative frequency. So what's a good example of that? So for example, if I'm very angry, right? When I get angry, like in the moment, right? Let's say just in some heated situation, I happen to get angry. I don't feel in my heart like it's pushing spiritual energy away. Or if I get upset or sad, I just don't feel that way. However, right? Let's say that I'm continuously giving into that anger. I'm continuously being upset and I'm mad. I'm angry at people, then there's a certain degree to which I can do it where it's like I'm too accepting of that negative frequency, and then it becomes sinful, right? So if I'm an angry person every day, then it will be sinful, and it is going to feel like now it's pushing my spiritual energy away. So that's very important. And so we talked about how charging your subconscious up at we talked about consent, right? So we talked about how what you think and say on a conscious level is a form of consent, but consent also expresses or manifests itself in terms of your subconscious charge, right? So that's another component of consent. So what I believe, and this is based on kind of observing my own thoughts, and what I feel like I've seen from others, is it's like when you accept a negative emotion too much, right? You're not trying to fight it, or it's not like something you just produce kind of in the moment, in the heat of the moment, but you're too accepting of it. It's almost like it's becoming part of you, right? It's becoming who you are. Like I said, if you're very angry all the time and you're okay with it, you're not trying to fight it, right? When that happens, it's like you're consenting to that negative. When you charge that negative emotion, it's like you're expressing a kind of consent, and that consent is basically saying that you don't want God in your life. Now, the consent that you are giving is for negative entities to come in your life, which we'll talk about in a moment. But it basically, you're not giving consent to God to be in your life, for Spirit to move in your life, because He isn't angry, right? He does not have that kind of anger, whereas you do, and you're saying you want it, right, by constantly giving in to this anger and accepting it, right? So and that's what makes it sinful, right? Because when you accept a negative thought or negative feelings or emotions like too much, then you're basically rejecting God by doing that, because He's not like that, nor is His nature isn't like that, nor does He want you to be like that. And so that's what makes it sinful. And so, again, this really applies to any negative emotion. When you're very hateful, very jealous, right? Or if you have a lot of lust in your heart, right? You're very lustful, right? Now, if you're now lust is a little bit different because it's tempting, right? Technically, all negative emotions might be a little tempting depending on the circumstance, but our body charges the sexual frequency, so we're very familiar with lustful thoughts, right? Now, if we're constantly giving into lust, then it becomes a sin, even if it doesn't necessarily immediately manifest itself as a behavior. Now, so when you constantly think lustful thoughts, right? What I was going to say, is if you're constantly fighting these thoughts, then that's different, right? Because this is something I felt, right? If you're fighting these thoughts, it doesn't feel sinful, right? So, like I said, it's a matter of how much you're accepting these thoughts. So if you're having negative thoughts and you're fighting them and you don't want them, they don't feel sinful. They don't feel like they push spiritual energy away. But if you're accepting them and you're not fighting them and you're very comfortable with them, then that's sinful, right? It's like they become you, and that's a form of consent in terms of what you want to be, basically, which is you want to be something that God isn't, and that's why it pushes spiritual energy away. So that basically is important. I just kind of want to get that out the way, that a thought, even if it doesn't lead to necessarily an action or behavior in the physical world, is still sinful if you accept it enough, right? And that's very important, because that lowers your spiritual energy, as any sinful thought or thought expressed as behavior does. And then when that spiritual energy drops, that's when the negative entities come in, right? So before I go into this next point, there actually is one thing I kind of wanted to address, which is a consequence of this. Oh boy. So I remember watching a video. So I think I saw a video. I don't exactly remember it. If I can find it, I'll put the link in the description. I saw a video where, excuse me, I think it was Dennis Prager. So he was talking about how it's okay to watch adult titles. So like I said, I call it that because that's what I used to call it when I worked at a cable company. You know what I'm talking about, right? So he says when you watch adult titles, that's okay to watch in marriage, right? Because that will help you to not cheat. I just, when I hear stuff like that, it's just funny to me, right? Because it's exactly what I told you guys about self-righteousness. Always some excuse to not measure up to God's standard of goodness, to try to make some random standard that humans or society accepts to call yourself good. But I'll get to that in a moment. But that was his assessment, right? And he was saying how it can't be bad or can't be evil because it doesn't lead to an external behavior. First of all, right, that is not true. That's not true, right? So one, at least according to my theory, right? So this is my belief. I'm not saying I know everything, but this is my belief, right? That is 100% wrong, right? Actually, before I even get into that, I don't know if it was him or someone else. In the video I watched, I think he said that. And then I think there was someone else, or it might have been the same one. I don't remember. It might have been him too. But they also said in that video, like I said, it might have been someone else. Like they might have cut to another interview. It was said that if you watch, like I don't even want to say it, right? Because it's that disgusting. But it was saying how if you watch AI, right? So not real people or characters, if you watch it with, we'll just say younger people, which is crazy. I don't know if it was him, but they were saying in the video, if you do it with younger people, that's not evil, and that prevents you from doing it in the real world. That is amazing to me, right? But what does it ultimately come down to? What does it come back to? It comes back to exactly what I was telling you guys. Self-righteousness, right? Self-righteousness is an amorphous floating island that people appeal to because they want to see themselves as a righteous or good person. The problem with it is that it has no core. You can make anything seem good by that standard. However, using this standard that I've set up, right, with this theory, and you can use the Bible as well, it basically says the same thing as far as I know. Absolutely not. So that is, first of all, that is absolutely negative and evil and sinful, and it definitely pushes spiritual energy away, right? You can come up with whatever theory or whatever idea you want to call yourself good, right? And he says that if it doesn't lead to external behavior, it can't be evil. Why, right? So first of all, it doesn't matter. First of all, it doesn't matter if it leads to external behavior. Sinfulness, as we've defined it, is something that pushes spiritual energy away, right? You will always know when something is sinful based on that negative feeling. The Bible says God's laws are written on a man's heart. That was what I believe the Bible's talking about. You don't think that you're going to feel a negative feeling from doing that, right? Just because it's not expressed as a behavior in society? What does that have to do with anything? That's such a random, sort of meaningless sort of metric for someone to set up. But of course, they ignore the fact that it feels wrong in their heart, right? You didn't have to do something that felt wrong in your heart. They make it sound like it's a given that you're forced to do that. No. God's standard is God's standard of goodness is for us to be in repentance, right? Which means we're making a good faith effort not to do things that push spiritual energy away. Guess what, right? If you're in a marriage and you're having thoughts of cheating, or if, God forbid, if you have, which this is even worse, right? If you have thoughts about watching things with younger people, right? Then guess what? You're just going to have to do the work, right, to not have those thoughts. It is not better, right? Well, let me put it this way. You are not reaching God's standard of goodness, right? You are not a good person because you're watching it with AI or something, right? Like that doesn't mean, who cares if you're doing that? So like this is what I'm talking about with self-righteousness, right? People making up their own standard of what goodness is. No, if you follow God's standard of goodness, you're just going to fight those feelings and overcome the temptation to become a better person for it, right? And he will help you do that if you want his help. But you are going to do it, right? There's no just settling for this sort of lesser evil, right? Where you're still giving into it, but hey, it's not affecting other people, so it's okay. So absolutely not. That's crazy to me. And don't even take my word for it. If when a person does it, they still feel that negative energy. They still feel that negative feeling. That's the feeling of spiritual energy going away, right? So and if you were to set up a standard of goodness, if one measures it by the thoughts or behaviors you engage in, which create that feeling, then that is still evil, right? So it's kind of silly. It's still sinful. So it's kind of silly to just make up some metric which includes that and includes a person accepting it like it's no big deal and then still call it good. Nonsense. But even still, we can even go further. Now, if you accept the theory that I set up in chapter 10, right, that behavior still causes other people. It still actually affects the world. It actually doesn't matter that you didn't express it as an external behavior. We'll talk about it later, but the very act of watching that stuff will cause other people to engage in those behaviors. It increases the probability of those behaviors manifesting in other people and in society. So it still damages society just by watching that stuff, right? Excuse me, and we'll talk about that later, in chapter 10. So it's like, it's just silly. And it's like, but you might say, well, he doesn't necessarily know metaphysics like that. Exactly. But that's why you listen to God, right? Stop trying to be a good person on your own. If he had had a strong relationship with God and asked him, God would have told him any truth in a way that doesn't necessarily require all this metaphysics. Because God and the Holy Spirit are the best teachers in Jesus Christ. And so it's like, I just thought it was important to kind of talk about that. Because you will see people in self-righteousness. Again, people engage in self-righteousness because they always like the standard of sin, right? They like to have a good chunk of sin and be comfortable with it, right? Because God's standard of repentance for goodness and having a strong relationship with him and engaging in moral behaviors, it's too high. It's too much work for a lot of them. So they like to set up this lower standard of righteousness, which is based on man's standard, and they lean into that and say, look, I'm a good person relative to that standard. Who cares, right? God's standard is the absolute standard. So that's just an example of what you will see, right? That when people use self-righteousness to just make themselves a good person, picking the most terrible things to do, which makes them still sinful. And if a person does that, right? Let's say a person does what that was recommended in that video, they're still going to be engaging in sinful behavior, even if they think of themselves as good. And what's going to happen is the spiritual energy will get pushed away. And then when it goes to much lower levels, then something worse can happen, right? A negative entity can latch onto you. It can latch onto your subconscious, and then it gets even worse. And so to go to this next point, it says negative entities can charge at specific negative frequencies and for specific purposes. This allows them to have certain specialties in destroying you, right? Which is always their goal. So their goal is always basically to separate you from God and get you to behave in a way that is antithetical to the nature of Jesus Christ. So basically they want you to behave in a kind of antichrist, beast-like kind of way. So now to go over this and kind of where I got this from. So when I was first kind of coming up with this theory and trying to understand the phenomena of negative entities related to the subconscious. This was years ago, right? So I didn't have the framework of all these ideas I've set up now. At that time, I was actually kind of thinking about, the fact we're actually going to talk about in chapter 10. We're not really there yet. Because at the time, I was studying the concept of sigils. So sigils are basically, they're kind of like symbols that are associated with negative entities. Usually, like in witchcraft and Satanism, they will know which ones are associated with which demon or negative entity. And so years ago, I was basically coming up with the idea. I was coming up with these ideas, and I had a theory about, basically about how the superconscious or the subconscious growth grid, which again, I didn't really have it set up in that way yet, but I was just kind of coming up with the concepts back then. I was thinking about how that is related to demonic contact and things like that. And again, now I've expanded on that theory like crazy from that time, which we'll talk about more about that in chapter 10. So that basically relates to how music and movies and things you watch and things like that, when you watch them, your intention charges in a way that basically expresses consent for demonic entities to come into your life. And it takes away consent for God's Spirit to come into your life. Those are basically based on metaphysical principles, which are generally used in the occult. So we'll talk more about that in chapter 10, because we don't really have the framework set up that much yet. But back then, I was basically studying that idea. So I went to this Satanist website, right? It was like a demonic website. It wasn't demonic or Satanist in the sense of saying they're wrong. This apparently is a website for people who love that stuff, right? And it was talking about how demonic entities will specialize in different things, right? So it talked about how some of them specialize in helping you to astral project, some of them specialize in helping you to use psychic abilities, some of them specialize in helping you to get money, and things like, and other things, right? So I noticed, and when I was thinking about it and I saw it, I was like, that makes sense, right? Because that would have kind of explained kind of the things I was trying to explain to myself when I was creating the theory. So like I said, that was years ago, and that's kind of where I got this idea from. It just made sense based on what I was seeing. So, to go back to this, basically, like I said, negative entities also have a subconscious mind. And what they do is they can charge up at specific negative frequencies. So like we said, they're cut off from God, so they can't charge a positive frequency. But they can charge different negative frequencies. Now, let's say that a negative entity charges up at the anger frequency. Well, what that allows them to do, let me just see something. Yeah, actually, I was going to get into this point. But what that allows them to do, when they charge up at a particular negative frequency, let's say it's the anger frequency, if you're also charged up at the anger frequency, then that actually allows them to have an easier time transcendentally connecting to you. And that'll impact what you think at a subconscious level. And to go over this point, this is basically the same, what I was saying, is the more you charge up at a negative frequency, the more easily a particular entity who specializes in that frequency can connect to you. So very important. So what do we say about transcendental connection, right? So the more you connect to, the more you transcendentally connect to a particular being, the more your subconscious imitates the nature of that being, right? And it in transcendental connection preserves volatility. So if you're charged up at a negative frequency of anger, then a spirit of anger, right, has an easier time connecting to you, especially because you have a lower amount of spiritual energy in that process. So this is basically someone who isn't like charging up just a little bit of negative emotion of anger, right? If someone charges up when someone charges up a huge amount or more and more and more of it, the negative entity has an easier time transcendentally connecting to you more and more and more, which we'll talk a little more about that in a moment. But for the moment, suffice it to say that when that happens, it's like they're trying to latch onto you, right? And at some point, they kind of connect and they latch onto you. And what they're going to start doing is, what's going to happen is your subconscious is going to start imitating the behavior of the negative entity, which, like I said, is basically an antichrist behavior. It's basically a beast-like evil behavior, right? So it is directly antithetical to the moral behavior and nature of Jesus Christ. And so an entity can charge up at many different frequencies. And like I said here, they can even charge up for different purposes. So, like I said before, there are entities that can charge up to help you astral project, use psychic abilities, use magic in certain ways, which is just a specific type of psychic ability, and using metaphysical principles. There are those who can help you get money and things like that, which I think those types of negative entities sort of plague the entertainment industry. A lot of celebrities, I believe, contact those entities. So they can have purposes, right? Which we'll talk even a little more about that in the next section, at least when we talk about psychic possession. But the other type of entities can just connect you simply through the frequency. So if you're very, very angry, then you'll get a demon of anger that latches onto you and starts transcendentally connecting to you and then basically infecting your subconscious mind. If you're a very jealous person, right, very greedy or hateful, right, you will get a negative entity for each one of those types that will latch onto you and start impacting your subconscious behavior. Right, and so a well-known one is a lust demon, right? So those actually have a name because they're so common, which is a succubus or incubus. Succubus for men, right? Incubus for women. And those demonic entities will latch onto you if you continuously give in to lust, right? So you're not fighting those thoughts. Those thoughts, like I said, they're very tempting, but if you don't fight them, then if you just accept them and you're comfortable with them and you give in to them, then your spiritual energy starts to recede, so it gets pushed away. And then you can have a negative entity latch onto you, which increases those feelings of lust and will impact your behavior. Like I said, we'll talk more about it in a moment. So very important, the more deeply you charge at a negative frequency, the more easily these negative entities can latch onto you. If you're very hateful, right, then you'll get a demon of hate in you. By the way, if you're also very sad, right, very depressed, you'll get a depressed demon that latches onto you, right? So this can happen. It's very important to recognize that there are things going on in the metaphysical realm, which even if you're not aware of it or you think it doesn't exist, like it's still happening, right? And the more deeply negative you go, these things will latch onto you. You're not allowed. There's really no way to just continuously charge a negative frequency and avoid the impact of these entities. They will latch onto you and basically infect your subconscious mind. They'll give you a subconscious infection, right? So to go here to this next point, negative entities can plant a suggestion into our subconscious. Perceptually, this will seem like another voice outside of yourself. So very important. That's basically what all of this leads to. So we talked about how for a transcendental connection, like I said, your subconscious will imitate the behavior of the thing you're connecting to. Now, when you're connecting to positive beings, right? Like I think I don't know if I mentioned in the last video, but positive beings basically respect your free will, right? So when you transcendentally connect to angels and the Holy Spirit and Jesus Christ and God and things like that, they all have the ability to plant a suggestion in your mind, right? And that will feel like I said before, in the section on spiritual energy, it'll feel like a voice, right? It'll feel like a compulsion that has like a signature or an identity to it that you know is different from the one it's different from the one that it normally has when it's coming from your intention and from your body, right? The compulsion that comes from others, it just feels a little different, and there's a signature to it that reflects like whatever being is planting the suggestion. And so that when you recognize that signature from this compulsion, you will feel the need to describe it as a voice, right? Because you recognize that there's some unique, it's like there's a unique identity and signature, this compulsion that's there every single time. And presumably, if this entity is the same one each time, one of those compulsions will have the same signature. So that's what it feels like. And this happens in a good way when you're connecting to positive entities, right? And it's like I said, it happens with the Holy Spirit. When you charge a lot of spiritual energy, the voice of the Holy Spirit gets louder. But there's also a negative version of it, right? So the negative version, of course, is negative entities, right? So when your spiritual energy drops, right, from continuously engaging in sinful behaviors and or sinful thoughts, what ends up happening is there's some negative frequency you're charging up at because your spiritual energy is dropping, right? And some negative entity is going to latch onto you and increase their connection to you. Now, with negative entities, it's a little bit different because when you charge spiritual energy, you're giving consent to high frequency beings, right? To basically interact with you and connect to you. Now, they respect your free will. So even though they are able to connect to you, how they interact with you is still basically a reflection of your free will, your sovereignty, what you'd like to be done, things like that. But just to some degree, you can only get to the higher levels by accepting God, right? However, and so so you have to basically allow a certain amount of influence, right, or consent to reach the higher levels of spiritual energy from the higher. You have to allow a certain amount of consent from higher beings. But at the lower level, so when your spiritual energy is at a very low level, and that basically the same as giving consent to these negative entities to come into your life, they don't care about your free will at all, right? They don't care about your free will. They don't care about your sovereignty. They have no interest in what you'd like to be done and things like that. They couldn't care less about that. So what they will do is kind of force or kind of plant suggestions in a way that's more forcing themselves into your subconscious and into your life, right? Which we all technically have the ability to do something similar, right? I can plant a suggestion in someone else's mind. They can plant one in my mind. So we talked about the subconscious world grid, how we all kind of plant suggestions in each other's mind. But you can do it in a more direct way, right? And that's what they try to do. And that's basically that happens when they latch onto you. Or that's basically how that occurs when they latch onto you and connect to you. Now, when they plant a suggestion in your subconscious, what basically happens is your subconscious it'll be quantized in a certain way. So it'll switch to a particular frequency and start expressing itself in the way that reflects the suggestion made by the negative entity, right? So the negative entity could basically just focus on you, trying to connect to you, and it can think a negative thought, and your subconscious will basically imitate that thought, right? And of course, the thought is always going to be something very evil, very negative, which we'll talk a little more about that in a moment. But to go over this next point, the more you listen to the negative voice, the louder it becomes and the more intense the influence. So this is very important. So basically what ends up happening is, this is something I believe happens when you, let's say the negative entity plants a suggestion in your mind. It actually starts off very, very weak, right? Like I said, negative entities can plant suggestions in everyone's mind, and they regularly do, right? So even if you have a decent amount of spiritual energy, they can still do it. It's just very quiet, right? Because you're not as connected to the entity, right? And the Bible talks about this, I believe, too. I forget the passage. What I will say is that when your spiritual energy goes higher and higher, then their voice gets quieter and quieter. The compulsion or the suggestion gets less intense. It's much easier to sort of just ignore it. But if your spiritual energy drops, and let's even say it's at a normal range, like normal for us humans, right? So it's not a transcendental level because your body charges spiritual energy. If they plant a suggestion in your mind, it's a little bit louder, but still not too loud. Here's what happens. If they plant a suggestion for you to do something, right? Let's say it's a suggestion to yell at someone in anger, right? If you give into that suggestion, what I believe happens is that it's like you're expressing consent for this negative entity to come into your life more and to connect to you more. Now, basically, the theory behind it, to explain that, involves a little bit of what we'll talk about in chapter 10. So it's a little hard to more fully explain it now. But suffice it to say that it basically is a form of consent, right? So like I said earlier, you give consent at a conscious level, but consent is also given as you charge, right? It's a reflection of your subconscious charge. And when an entity plants a suggestion and you perceive that suggestion, right? So your subconscious compels you. And when you make a decision to get into that compulsion, right? Because no matter how strong a compulsion is, you can still resist it, right? If you feel a compulsion to yell at someone in anger, you can just resist it and say, no, I don't feel like doing that. But here's what happens. If you say, yeah, I'm going to yell at this person in anger, it's like now you've accepted it. And what that ultimately does is it gives consent for that demonic entity to come into your life more and and what that basically means is they connect to you more. And any suggestion they place in your subconscious, it becomes stronger, louder, right? So it's harder to ignore. And if you continuously give into that suggestion from the negative entity, they connect to you more and they keep connecting to you because you're giving consent. Basically, on a subconscious or in a metaphysical way, you're saying you want to behave like the negative entity. You want the negative entity to direct you. That's what it means to give consent to their suggestion. Basically, that's what it means to give into their suggestion. It's giving consent to say that you want them to direct you and guide you, right? So your subconscious charges in a way that makes that easier, right? So their voice becomes louder and their compulsions become stronger and stronger and harder to ignore. Now, when you give consent to God and Jesus Christ to come into your life, you charge spiritual energy, right? And so the voice of the Holy Spirit becomes louder and your behavior becomes more like Jesus Christ. So it's basically the same thing, but that's in the positive direction. And in the negative direction, it happens with a negative entity. And so if you keep giving into these behaviors, then it leads to full-blown possession, right? So go over to this next point. When your connection to the entity increases far enough, you become emotionally possessed. This allows the entity to plant extremely powerful suggestions in your subconscious continuously. So that's very important. So basically, as you continuously give into these suggestions, your subconscious, what basically happens is the suggestion they plant becomes extremely powerful. It starts off very light, very easy to ignore, very easy to resist. But the more you give into these suggestions by the negative entity, they become more powerful and they become much harder to resist, right? And so, for example, it's kind of like what we talked about in chapter 1 in book 1, right? So when you're dieting, right, you feel a very strong compulsion to eat, right? That compulsion is actually coming from your body. And you could, if you see like your favorite food, right, it's very hard not to eat it, right? You can still resist the compulsion because no matter how strong a compulsion is, it does not override free will. However, it's hard to resist it, right? And negative entities do the same thing. When when you're possessed, so when you have a full-blown possession and your connection to the entity is extremely strong, they will plant extremely powerful suggestions. So it'll feel kind of similar to when you really want to, when you're dieting and you really want to eat something, but you're fighting it, right? So the suggestions they plant will, of course, be hugely and intensely negative and extremely gross, negative, evil behaviors. Like they could plant a suggestion in your mind to kill a person, right? And so what will actually happen is you'll feel this intense urge all the time. Now, another thing I forgot to mention is even though they plant suggestions in everyone, they can't necessarily do it all the time in a strong way. We'll talk a little more about that later when we talk about spiritual texts, but that's kind of what I noticed. But when you have a full-blown possession, they can do it all day, right? They can plant it. You can't get away from it. They can just continuously keep hammering your subconscious, and basically it'll be an attack of attrition, right, on your willpower. You'll continuously feel these intense, palpable urges all day to do something extremely evil, right? So I believe that certain people, when they feel an intense urge to like kill, they sometimes will just use animals because it's less consequential in terms of the laws of society. So they'll kill an animal, and what ends up happening, and this is another thing that happens at the entities. This is what happens when you have an infection in your subconscious. When you kill the animal, so when you finally give into the urge, it'll feel like catharsis. You'll actually feel a little bit good from giving into that urge because now you feel a little bit of relief. You finally gave into the urge of killing the animal, which you felt all day. But here's the thing, that relief is not going to last very long. So it'll actually feel like a form of negative pleasure, right? Because like I said, your subconscious is imitating the nature of the entity. So the entity enjoys things like that, and now you're starting to enjoy things like that. So you would like kill the animal, and then you might feel a little bit good for a moment. You'll feel relief, and you'll actually feel a little bit of negative pleasure from it. And then, of course, after a while, the urge is going to come back again. Now you have to kill again and kill, and then it's basically an endless cycle, right? And so it'll keep happening. And this is what negative entities do. When you're, like I said, when you're emotionally possessed, right? So that, like I said, that type of possession occurs as a result of charging some negative emotion over and over and over, essentially deep charging it, and constantly giving in to these suggestions from the negative entity, right? And so then when you become emotionally possessed, right, you'll be possessed at some negative frequency, and it could be different ones. They basically latch onto you. We're basically wherever you're weak, right? So they can latch onto you if you're very angry, if you're very hateful, like if you're a racist person, you hate these groups of people, or you hate, just different types of people beyond race, or if you're very lustful, you have an extraordinary amount of lust in you, you're not fighting it, you're giving into it. What ends up happening is the demonic entities will plant suggestions in your subconscious mind to give into this form of lust, give into that form of lust. And as you keep doing it over and over, they're going to start to, I forgot to mention, there's actually a grooming process, right? So basically, before you connect to this entity more and more, so before you have a real infection on your hands, it wouldn't really make sense for them to plant a suggestion that's too extreme when you have a lot of spiritual energy, right? So let's say they plant a suggestion to kill someone. When you feel that compulsion, you'll be like, no, I'm not killing anybody, right? Because you have too much spiritual energy. It's too uncomfortable for you. So they will plant a suggestion that's a little more reasonable, that makes a little more sense. So instead of planting a suggestion to kill somebody, they might plant a suggestion to say, hey, just something that convinces you to be angry at this person, right? Oh, that person wronged you in some way, or that person basically called you stupid or thinks this of you, right? They can plant a suggestion like that in your mind. And so when that happens and you give into it, like, yeah, that person is this and that. Now you've expressed some form of consent for the negative entity, right? And now the negative entity will plant, the negative entity will do that for a little while, and then the suggestion will become a little more extreme when it doesn't feel as shocking to you. And then it'll keep doing that more and more, and then as you keep expressing consent more and more to the compulsion of the entity or the suggestion, you're connecting more. And as you connect more and your subconscious gets more infected, right, it's going to start to express itself in a way that's more antithetical to the nature of God and Jesus Christ. And then eventually, it's like I said, it's like a grooming process. More extreme behaviors are going to seem more and more rational to you. And so, going back to the lust-based behavior, they can plant a suggestion to engage in lust in some way. So that could be watch some type of adult title, do it in some situation that makes no sense to you, like when you're outside, but you feel this urge so powerfully, right? People think those urges come from the body. No, right? To some degree it can come from the body, but it isn't always from the body, especially when it's so perverse and when it's so intense. That can come from these entities, right? And so when you keep giving into these urges and you start to connect to these lust-based entities more, what they'll do is they'll start planting more perverse types of urges in you, right? And that's when people sort of get into these crazy fetishes, right, that are very, very evil, right? And so, like I said, I don't even know that I need to mention it, but you can kind of imagine the fetishes people have, any things they watch that could get them locked up, right? Those come from these entities, right? And it will happen if you continuously give into these urges. So a form of emotional possession from lust can result in very gross sort of pornographic taste, and it can also result in people engaging in the R word, right? So doing things like that. And so I believe that that will happen from these entities, right? But like I said, I don't know if I mentioned yet, if you're very sad or very depressed, right? These entities can actually cause you to become more depressed the more you accept negative feelings. So let's say you hate yourself and you call yourself this and you call yourself that. That can be a suggestion from them. And when you attack yourself more and more, right, they plant suggestions in your mind more and more. And eventually they can plant very extreme suggestions to just commit suicide. They'll plant a thought in your mind that says, well, you're not even worth it, right? Basically, I just need to leave this world to go to heaven or basically be in a better place. They'll plant a suggestion in your mind that makes that seem rational and logical to you, right? And so that suggestion might not work right away, but they need your spiritual energy to drop enough, right? And when it does, boom, right, they're going to start to plant more extreme suggestions, and that can get a person to commit suicide. They can get you, if you're very jealous or angry, they can get you to attack somebody or kill them out of jealousy. If you're very greedy, they can get you to sort of sacrifice everyone else's wants for your own so you can get more. So they can result in different behaviors, but ultimately it's going to come down to some sort of inspired thought as a result of an emotion, right? That's going to be the angle from which the negative entity will infect you, right? So very important, right? That basically, in a nutshell, is how emotional possession works. And when it comes to tempting behaviors, that's why it's so important to fight these behaviors, right? So going back to this, what I was talking about earlier, it's kind of silly, at least from this perspective, to think that if you watch something in AI, like it matters, right? But if you watch something in AI, that's okay. It's not, right? Not only are you still engaging in sinful behaviors that's push spiritual energy away, so the Spirit of God isn't able to work in your life as much, and not only are you still putting energy out there that's gonna, we'll talk more about in chapter 10, I can't really go into it now, but it's going to cause other people, it's going to increase the likelihood that they're going to be engaged in sinful behavior, so it's not even localized just to yourself. But even still, a negative entity can even latch onto you. Like, there are always consequences to behaving in a way that's antithetical to the nature of Jesus Christ. Like, you can't just put it in a box and say this is okay. It's never okay, right? Again, that is the sort of nonsense that people come up with when they're appealing to self-righteousness. That's why it never works, right? Because it's always some excuse or always some sort of reasoning a person gives to justify sinful behavior, right? True goodness is absolute. True goodness comes from God, and it doesn't justify sinful behavior, right? The standard of goodness, as I said, for God is repentance. You're trying to get away from sinful behavior, and you're trying to have the Spirit of God work in your life more. That's always going to lead to positive outcomes. If God isn't there, then it's never going to lead to a positive outcome. It doesn't matter how much your mind tries to rationalize it, and doesn't matter how much you try to create some framework to call yourself a good person. As long as you're engaging in willful sin, it's always going to lead to negative outcomes, and there's nothing you can do about it. That's how nature was set up. And so when you engage in sinful behaviors, even if you think it's just yourself, these entities will absolutely latch onto you, right? Plant suggestions in your subconscious, and then it's going to get more and more extreme. There's really nothing you can do about it. And so that's why at some point, you're just going to have to resist. You're going to have to develop the willpower and the strength of mind, for at least for like temptation, things that tempt you. You're going to have to develop the willpower and strength of mind to resist these urges, right? And as you resist these urges and these suggestions from this negative entity more and more, then you develop more spiritual energy. The urges become weaker, right? You start to behave more like Jesus Christ, and things get easier. One thing I forgot to mention is that when your spiritual energy drops to very low levels, you're basically, like I said, you're not giving consent to God. That's giving consent in a way that says you don't want God and spirit in your life. Now, they will help you to eradicate this infection. Actually, I'll talk about that later in the chapter. But I'll just say it now since I brought it up. They'll help you to eradicate this infection, but you have to give them permission. They're not like the negative entities, and they just do whatever they do without your permission. They need your permission. They respect your free will. And so people in this state, if they call out to God or Jesus Christ, they will help them to develop the willpower to overcome the negative entity and just really to eradicate the negative entity anyway and break the connection. But if you don't give that consent, right, to God, then you're kind of just at the mercy of the negative entity if you keep giving in to their suggestions. So you don't want to do that. So basically, that's how emotional possession works. Very important to be aware of that. If you continuously charge up at a negative frequency, you will get a subconscious infection that will lead to more extreme negative behaviors from you, and really all sinful behaviors are just sinful, but it's going to lead to very extreme sinful behaviors, and that's going to damage your life and society more and more and more, which is ultimately the goal of these entities. So in the next video, I'm going to talk about. Next video, we're going to kind of take a detour from the theory part. I'm just going to talk a little bit of. It's kind of a rant. I don't know how long it'll be because I wrote it in the book. I haven't done a huge amount of research. I've done a little research, but it's basically just a rant about the issues with modern psychology. Because in modern psychology, they don't think this is real, and that leads to a lot of problems for people, right? And so I'm going to talk about that, and then we're going to go into psychic possession, which is a second kind of possession, right? But yeah, that's it for now, though. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.